So we will go ahead and get started. And before you make a big change like project delivery, you really need to know your why and making sure that there's a sense of urgency to be able to create this change. And so Dave was asking me, what was the kind of the catalyst that really made us want to think about things differently? And two stories came to mind. And this was in a time period about 2010, where the Denver metro area was recovering from the 2008 stock market and housing crash. And at that time, we were still doing qualification-based selection, which I know many of our local governments also use. But for us, what that looked like is we would have a list of about 10 firms. And from that list of 10, we would ask for qualifications. And then we would select typically three firms to do interviews. And so before 2010, and we weren't really getting everyone to respond back to us. So out of that 10, you may have had 7 that would actually give you a good response. And so picking 3 wasn't that challenging. But when we were going through this recovery period, there was a lot of work that was needed by our firms. And so we were getting 10 really solid proposals. And so picking from that 10 down to 3 was really challenging. And I can remember the last one I did, I had this massive spreadsheet, and it was like reading the New York Times to figure it out. And so after that big effort, then we would go to interviews, and we were splitting hairs at interviews because people were really doing their homework, pretty much coming in with like a preliminary design. They were doing utility investigations, talking to neighbors, really wanting to figure out, what was going to give them the edge to win the project. And so afterwards, when you're doing a debrief with firms, the one time I can remember actually saying to someone, well, you guys didn't dress up enough. And that somehow resonated with the selection team of, if you didn't dress up enough, must mean you didn't want the project enough. And that was just getting silly. And so we just thought there's got to be a better way.
And I got to say, Laura, I was a consultant at that time, and I remember very vividly what that was like. And that was the worst to do all that work. And I remember designing something for an interview and then not getting picked, and you're just beside yourself. It was not cool.
Exactly. And it was such a big investment. And I know some people thought as owners that was a good thing, but really that just comes down to overhead. You're having to put all that time in, and that's got to get paid for in some way. And so we were just finding that this huge effort was being going about, and it wasn't really benefiting anybody and just causing a lot of frustration. So that was kind of our first clue. We need to be doing something differently. And the other one I wanted to bring up is, we were also big believers in the traditional design bid build, where you're selecting the lowest qualified bidder. And qualified really just means that you can get bonded. It's a legal term. But one of the instances that I recall vividly is that we had a contractor who was tying his forms with actually rebar ties. And it was a short wall, but still. So as you can imagine, what happened when they placed the concrete, boom, the forms blew out. And when we approached the contractor about this, what he actually said to me was, don't worry, Laura, we're not even going to charge you for the extra concrete we placed to make a thicker wall for you at the bottom, because now that's more structurally sound. And that was the justification of it wasn't a problem. Well, these things are problems, we know, on the design side of the house. And the part that was frustrating is it just doesn't end that day. How many conversations we had to have afterwards about, well, is this going to crack? Is this really structurally sound? Should we make them rip it out? Just compels itself to keep going. And really what it just does is it sucks the life out of you and out of the project and out of the team. And again, we asked ourselves, is there a better way? And Dave, I think you have an instance too with a contractor.
Well, yeah, and I have a couple, and I'll just mention them briefly. One was, well, this project here, if you guys don't know, and I'm gonna try to paste this in the chat if I can figure out how to do that while I'm presenting. But and actually, as a side note, if you guys have questions, please put them in the chat as we're talking. We're gonna pause a couple times during the presentation. And Emily, if you wanna pick questions, if you will, I'm not gonna be looking at the chat too much, but you could lob those at us. We'll stop a couple times for questions. So
yep,
please
happy to do that.
Yeah, so this project, it had federal money in it. So Louisville was the contracting agency for that reason, and we had to low bid it, had to do an open bid because of the federal money in it. And for various reasons, we bid it in 2 phases, which I won't go into detail. And so we had 2 low bid contractors working side by side, and we had such a different experience with these 2 contractors. Like, one was horrible and one was great. That Mark Schutte was the engineer out in the field at the time for Olson on the project, that he documented any measurable difference we felt between the 2 contractors in every way he could think of. And then I made it a presentation, and it's a 10-minute talk, and I have it on our district's YouTube channel, and I recommend you check that out if you haven't. But it's where I tried to quantify the difference in a good contractor versus a crappy contractor. The other example, and it's the same contractor Laura mentioned with the forms blowing out, and we won't name who this person is, but I was in a progress meeting, and this guy's on one side of the table and one of his subs is on the other side of the table, and his sub got so mad at him during this meeting, and it's a couple of 60-plus-year-old gray-haired guys, that the sub threatened to come across the table and beat him up in our meeting. And you just got to imagine that that was the environment that sometimes got created by way of low bid, design bid build. So just a couple of anecdotes there.
Yeah. And when we were, trying to come up with this vision of project partnering, it really came down to, we wanted to transition from this idea of really day-to-day of like a dog fight. How do we move to a dog sled team that we're all going in that right direction? But like anything new, it didn't happen right away for us. We first looked internally of, how can we get more design or more presence out in the field to try to get a better quality in the project. We tried to tighten up our specs. And those things were really just incremental for us because we were just looking at ourselves as the owner. When we started actually then reaching out and talking to more people and researching alternative project deliveries, we realized it's not just us, right? We also have a contractor involved, the designer, and other stakeholders. And we really modeled a lot of what we learned from Fort Collins and their alternative project delivery option. And what we saw when we talked to all the players is that, obviously those that are in business need to make a profit, and we're okay paying a fair price. But everybody was very much interested in doing really great work. And those also wanted more work. And we wanted to continue relationships because we invested in a team learning something, and then to start all over again, that didn't really help. So as you can see from the colors, things really started lining up. And so the premises of what we came up with our alternative project delivery option was, it wasn't just about us, it was about everybody. And how do we find a solution that works for all of us? And so I think that's the premise of Project Partners, and what's made us so successful. It involves all of us working together. And so Dave's going to talk a little bit more about the details of what it means as far as the process goes.
Yeah, and I'll pause briefly just in case any questions have come up. Emily, did anybody put any questions in the chat yet?
Nope. I wanted to note that we are recording this session. We're going to have it on the CASFM YouTube channel, but no, nothing's come up quite yet.
Okay, no worries. And that is my Rosie on the left and Laura's Rosie on the right. Hers is a Malamute and mine's a old Cavachon, so hers could probably
a little size difference.
Yeah, a little size difference. I'll just say that. Yeah. Mine's gonna fit in my lap, and I don't know if Laura's will, but
I fit in Rosie's lap.
You ride her like a horse. Yeah. She's so big. Okay, so Project Partners. So I'll just be very brief because a lot of you are probably familiar with what it is, but I'm going to briefly kind of show you how it compares to other ways of delivering projects. So traditional, low bid, design bid build, you'll have an owner and then they contract with a designer and a builder. This unfolds sequentially in a linear fashion, and then you finally bid it and know your cost way over here on the right. When you're in a design build situation, you'll have a design build team that's one entity, and typically the consultant, the designer, works for the contractor rather than the owner. And this has certain sort of benefits in that, it's kind of a turnkey sort of thing. You'll usually see this with something really big and complicated, where maybe the owner lays out some performance metrics they want met, and then the design build team has to figure out how to meet it. And you'll often get the pricing they'll have to bid it maybe before they really get into final design. And then that final design happens as a combination of the designer and the builder, which is great. And then CMGC, which is really more of what Project Partners is based on, we contract separately with the designer and the builder. We kind of like having them answer to us rather than a designer answering to a builder first and foremost. We want them answering to us. And then the thing is, the contractor gets involved during design and helps us with design. We get some early pricing, and then we know our final pricing earlier and maybe even before final contract docs are complete. Yeah, so one of the problems with, well, sorry, let me go back here. So with the low bid, because it doesn't involve a contractor, it's, you're kind of trying to change order proof your plans, and it, it might still make sense for something simpler, like say you're gonna mill and asphalt a section of road. That's a very sort of, I don't know, defined scope of work. There's not a lot of discovery that's going to happen. Maybe there's some traffic control issues, but it's pretty contained sort of work. Versus some of the retrofit projects we build that are like messy and expensive in every way you can imagine. They're more like a maze, and not involving a builder until the very end of the game really makes it more difficult to get the right outcomes. Because what happens is, as you progress through a project, the ability to control costs goes way down the later in the game you are, and the cost to change something goes way up. And so you get sort of this linear handoff in the traditional design bid build, which feels kind of like a relay race. Like the owner hands it off to the designer, then the designer is going to hand it off to the contractor, and you don't get enough overlap. But what can happen in construction is, we were describing just a minute ago, is it gets a little rocky. It's not so smooth. And that baton feels maybe more like you're handing somebody a lit stick of dynamite. You're trying not to have it go off in your hands. And so what we've tried to do with Project Partners is, instead of a relay race, we're more of a team sport now, where this is the owner, the designer, the builder, all on the same team, trying to figure out what we're going to do to get to the same endpoint. And we all have alignment in the same goal that we're trying to get to. We also try to move that highest level of effort. Instead of spending all this effort trying to change order proof a set of plans, now let's move that effort to bringing the whole team together during design. And then once we get to the final plans, it's just a matter of stamping them, and everybody knows they're constructible and buildable and that we've got the budget. And really, it speeds things up quite a bit as well. So that's kind of one of the reasons why for Project Partners. As far as how it works, we use a pre-qualified selection process for consultants and contractors. We assemble teams from our pre-qualified lists using direct selection for smaller projects, and then a competitive interview process for larger projects. We try to save those for our biggest projects and not for the majority of them, for the reasons Laura mentioned earlier about how competitive and how much time and cost that was consuming. Accountability is a big part of it. It's achieved through vendor annual performance evaluations, and then by our staff and by local government stakeholders. And then each year, new vendors have an opportunity to be added to our list during a request for qualifications process. So one of the benefits we get is that because we're such a consistent source of work year after year after year, a designer or builder's desire for future work is a wonderful quality and cost control. And that's a pretty big thing that we get the benefit of. Another thing we really value with Project Partners and the way we deliver projects is trying to be really equitable with the way we distribute work amongst our on-call contract designers and builders to the extent that we can. And really, we want them all to have enough work from us on a consistent enough basis that they have a team or teams of people that are used to doing our work. And that really gains us that efficiency, right? That they have enough work so that they're busy at their place of work and can stay gainfully employed. And then they're doing our work enough that they are up to speed with how we do things. And that's a little tidbit I'd offer for local government people, if there are any listening, that I remember as a consultant, there's lots of communities that have on-call lists, and you'd be on an on-call list for some community, but it would never lead to any work. And this was really common. And I guess I would offer that we find that it's better to have a smaller list, but the firms get work and it's more meaningful. That makes it more meaningful and less of just sort of a symbolic thing, I think, and then everybody benefits. So I would argue for that, for local government folks listening in. Okay, so that was a little bit about the history of project partners, and it's a little bit about process. But you know, the intent of this talk is effective project partnering, right? Is really what we want to talk about, because when we talk about a partner, really that is, you know, somebody signs a contract and then they're a partner. You know, that means, you know, defines roles and responsibilities. It's like a noun, you're a partner. But the term partnering, that's really more of a verb. That's an action, that's an activity, and something you're intentional about, kind of like partnering in a square dance. I grew up in rural Nebraska, and I don't know if you guys had this experience, but I had to square dance in elementary school, and it was the most awkward thing ever. And I don't think I was probably a really great partner, because I don't know, it was just kind of awkward. But this is where there's a discretionary part of it. You know, this is where the contract may set out roles and responsibilities, but the partnering part is, it doesn't require you to be a good team member. It can't make you trust your fellow teammates. That's discretion that we all have, and we have personal choice about. We can't, you know, even as the owner, I can't tell you to trust me. That's just not how it works. So really, that's what the meat of this is that we want to get into. So like as an example, when we build larger CIP projects that take several years, in a way, we are forming these temporary organizations to accomplish certain goals. And really, what kind of culture, what kind of engagement makes these temporary organizations really functional, productive, and creative? So that's what we want to get into. And really, it starts with building professional trust. There's a great book by a fellow named Stephen M.R. Covey. He's the son of the guy that wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I think he's also named Stephen Covey, but this is the son, wrote this book. And he said to have that when there are high levels of trust, you're going to have, things are going to go fast and they're going to be at a low cost. And when you have low levels of trust, things are going to go slow and they're going to cost more. And I will tell you that this is where mistrust is something that is actually measurable. The cost of mistrust is measurable, he argues. And one of his best examples in his book is the TSA, going through the security lines at the airport. So if you remember flying pre 9/11, number one, it didn't take as long to get through security. It was very quick. You didn't have to take off your shoes or any of that stuff. And you may or may not realize this, but your ticket was cheaper because now there's a tax on your ticket to pay for all the TSA personnel that you see in this picture. And aside from that, with the Denver International Airport that you see there, that part of the airport wasn't built with post 9/11 security processes in mind. That was a retrofit to fit it to do that, right? And so that is the cost in time and money we all experience because of 9/11. So the trust in the traveling public went down, things slowed down, and they cost more. And so that's where the low bid environment feels very similar to the TSA. It's very untrusting, and you know that's why we try to change order proof our plans. I would say an extreme example of that is anytime you have federal money on a project. To me, the federalized money, it starts from a place of strong mistrust, and then the entire project team has to work really, really hard to do the very end of the project and then even beyond to prove their trustworthiness to get reimbursement or whatever, however it works. And then, so that mistrust leads to more time and more cost. So as an example, on this project you see here, this guy in orange you see kind of on the right side of the screen, this bridge, we were so desperate to federalize as little as possible on this project that the only federalized part of what you see in this picture was buying that bridge and setting it and then building some trail adjacent to it. And we built the abutments separately. With a local project, we were just trying to federalize as little as possible. But even still, the guy that was in that orange vest, I distinctly remember being out on the project site during a meeting when him, the contractor, was talking to the inspector, and they were like talking in another language about these forms that needed to be filled out for them to get paid. It was like, okay, so the 1099 form, we're gonna need to get that filled out before we can approve submittal 727B, and then we'll need the 2702 form filled out, and then we'll be able to pay you. And they went on for like 15 minutes like this, and it was like they were talking another language. I was just like awestruck. And then yeah, it just blew me away. It blew me away. So what we're trying to avoid that sort of thing. So really, this passage from Simon Sinek, he wrote this it's in a book called The Infinite Game. This is really kind of speaks to what we're trying to accomplish with project partners. And he said, in weak cultures, people find safety in the rules. This is why we get bureaucrats. They believe a strict adherence to the rules provides them with job security. And in the process, they do damage to the trust inside and outside the organization. In strong cultures, people find safety in relationships. Strong relationships are the foundation of high-performing teams, and all high-performing teams start with trust. So that's really what we're trying to accomplish with project partners. Now, it's not to say we shouldn't have rules, but if that's all we have are rules, then it's going to take longer and cost more money. I've had contractors tell me that federalized projects easily cost 20% more than locally funded projects. That is the cost of mistrust. Okay, so that's why we like project partners. But it hasn't been all sunshine and rainbows. So we want to get into some lessons learned that we want to share that we think can help our teams be even more functional and high performing. Before we get into that, though, I'll just do another little puppy pause. Emily, I don't know if anybody put any questions in the chat.
Yeah, there were a couple of sort of comments or questions. So one of them was local governments sometimes require a bidding process and justification when the lowest bidder is not chosen. So how can you build collaborative project partnership and relationships when there are those types of restrictions?
That's a great question. And I actually think the lessons learned that we're going to talk about next are not exclusive of other processes. So I think some of the takeaways that we're going to talk about are things that you can easily implement even with a low bid process.
Yeah, I would offer that, this is a tough story to sell because low bid people get it. They feel like they're getting it less expensive, but you just could never know that. And I would argue that you probably don't. For some of the reasons we were talking about earlier with what can happen with the contractors. I would offer that changing a process like this that uses a lot of money and can be controversial is not something to just do one day. We took years to change to this process. And part of that building professional trust was us showing our leadership like, hey, we can do these smaller $200,000 projects with just a direct selection of an on-call. And hey, we documented with case studies like, hey, here's what the benefits we're getting out of it. And look at and then conversely, we're documenting problems we're having on low bid projects to really start selling that story. And so I think, part of the answer to me to that question is trying to change a process with purchasing or whoever is the decision maker but trying to build a story to get there and why. Yeah.
Great, thanks. One other question was regarding bringing the contractor on earlier in the process. Is it normally only a pre-construction or estimator team member from the contractor? And if so, would it be beneficial to try to get a project manager or superintendent involved to get insight into constructability?
Yeah, that's something we learned early on because that is exactly what happened to us. We were having like the project estimator on the project and realizing they weren't translating things back down into when we were actually going to construction. And so that's definitely a requirement on our end is we really like having the superintendent at the table with us. Good point.
Cool. That's all the questions, comments we have right now.
All right. Thanks, guys, for participating. This is a difficult format for Dave and I to begin with of not being able to see all of you. So this gives us a little something. So thank you for staying involved. So we've got 5 lessons learned that we wanted to share out. And again, think about these in a little broader sense too, especially I appreciate those that are in local government that you really are under the state statute that says you have to work with a low bidder. But building trust and respect all in a project team are always going to benefit you no matter where you are. And so one of the first points we wanted to bring out was this idea of permission to color outside the lines. And with that, when you're on a team for a reason. We don't pay somebody to be a project partner just to hang out. And so know that you're worthy of being at the table. And so being curious and asking questions of the team is something that we really appreciate. And then, how do you work as a team to challenge each other and build on ideas? And so Dave and I are going to talk about a couple of examples with that. And the first one for me started out with Mary Powell asking a project team at one point, and this is, 10 plus years ago, of why do we build these really massive drop structures? Why does it have to go to 100-year level? And she's like, and she just prefaced it as, I'm not an engineer, so I don't even know if I should be asking this. But it's great that she did ask us. And so this is an example of what we did for years, and sometimes it's still appropriate, but we made these huge mattresses. And as a comparison, the building to the left is an apartment building. That's the size of grouted rock that we were putting in.
And I'd guess there's like 50 people that live in that building. Like look how big that is. It's like 3 stories, and it's like, oh my gosh.
And we're coming at it from, we're distorting a lot of land, a lot of great vegetation. Can we come up with a smaller approach? And sure enough, you do a little bit more on the hydraulics end of it, you can see really what erosive forces you're looking at. And so same system, further upstream, we're able to manage it in a different way. So by the fact that Mary felt comfortable in that team to be asking questions that really, weren't her background, stimulated the rest of us to think about things differently, and we got a much better product at the end. And it's really changed the way we've approached drop structures since then.
Yeah, and I think that's a big thing because Mary's a biologist. I think she would characterize herself as a biologist, right, Laura?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so that's where some might think this would be outside of her lane to talk about, and well, why not? I mean, like, it doesn't matter where ideas come from. I think that's part of the point.
Exactly. And then, Dave, you want to touch on maybe some psychological safety from your perspective? Actually, I have one more slide, don't I?
Yeah.
Okay, we're just going to keep rolling. Another example that I had where I felt really uncomfortable, but we're talking about the layout of a park. And so I was just planning on sitting back and letting the parks departments start talking about what they wanted to do. And this was a project out on the South Platte River called River Run. And a big thing for Englewood was having a shelter that they could host large events at. And so they wanted like 250 people to be seated. And they're talking about this massive structure, and one, of course, cost. But then I was thinking, just from my own perspective, when I'm out with people, they can be intimidating, these really large shelters, especially when they're not used very often. And so I felt comfortable enough with that group to kind of chime in and suggest, is that something we really want to do? And then that caused the design engineer to say, what if we just did a concrete pad as part of it that you could then put a temporary tent structure, so you could still have it when you wanted it, but then other parts of the time when it's not being used for an event, you've got more of a open area that people could hang out at. And so it was nice to be able to feel comfortable to be able to share ideas outside of being landscape architects, to build off of what could get us to a better design solution.
Yeah, well, that's great. Yeah, I often joke when I start trying to wear my landscape architect hat that I'm well out of my bounds and don't take me seriously. But hey, if you like my idea, great. But
we don't get offended.
I'm not going to assume that my ideas are good ones when I'm trying to play in that realm. But that's where a thing called psychological safety is extremely important, because people's willingness to chime in and offer ideas in general, let alone about something outside of your sort of direct area of expertise, well, it requires comfort that it's not going to, I don't know, be met with scorn from the team or frowns or what, stay in your lane, Dave, or whoever that might be. So just a brief story of this landscape plan you see here. I was in a design meeting for this project, and I think there's like 12 of us around this conference room table, and the landscape architect unfurls this roll plot that's like 6 feet long, and it's twice as long as what you see here, and it's got all these. It is exactly this. It's all these plant symbols and stuff that some of which I know what they are, and most of which I don't, and they're saying, okay, to the ownership team, do you guys want to provide some input on this? Do you have any concerns? And I was just kind of looking at these symbols and feeling a little out of my element. And I just sort of impulsively said, oh, I'm an engineer and it looks good to me. And I kind of waved my hand over it, sort of like giving it my magic blessing, if you will. And then the meeting started pivoting just to another topic for about 5 or 10 seconds. And then I thought for a second, I was like, actually, I do have some questions about the planting plan, and I started peppering the design team with questions about, okay, where's the woody material and taller stuff's going to be? Are people going to be able to get to the creek? How thick is this going to grow? We have to cut it down in 3 years. And by about my third question, there was a fellow stakeholder sitting right next to me, one of the ownership team, and he got tired of my questions. He wasn't interested in the planting plan, and over my shoulder to my left, he does one of these. He goes, oh, and I exaggerate only slightly. That's what he did. And I kind of look at him. And I'm like, you all right? Can I continue? And, it's a person that I have a good relationship with. So we give each other a hard time. And I'm really extroverted. So it takes more than that to really stop me. I just kind of go. And, but here's the thing, and so we were fine, no big deal. But here's the thing: after the meeting, one of the people on the design team said to me, "Dave, I actually wanted to talk about the planting plan more, but I wasn't going to bring it up after I saw how you were made fun of." So even though it was one member of the ownership team making fun of just another owner, it stifled everybody. They were like, "Oh, I'm good. I don't know, nothing to see here." So that term psychological safety, if you want to know the literal definition of it, it's a sense of confidence that the team will not embarrass, reject, or punish someone for speaking up, like me, poor me. And it describes a team climate characterized by interpersonal trust and mutual respect in which people are comfortable being themselves. Yeah. And so I think that this is foundational to having really functional teams on our projects.
Very much so.
Okay, so on to the next one.
All right. So important. Inclusion takes longer, but it will take you farther. Can't emphasize this enough. And I think our instincts as engineers, that many of us are, it's to just go solve it ourselves and get there and accomplish it. But it's worth the investment. And so when you're inclusive, though, you have to make sure that you are over communicating for a bit. And our suggestion is to cast a wide net of project advocates. And, oftentimes we want to bring in like the Corps of Engineers or, FEMA. So really think largely, but sometimes we forget about some of the smaller elements. And so this is a project that Barb worked on from our office. And she was working with Denver. And there's a lot of people to engage at Denver and thought they did a pretty good job. But who they missed was forestry. And so forestry didn't know anything or background about the project. They start it and they end up getting a fine because they didn't understand what forestry was looking for either. But the really neat thing about Barb, if you know her from our office, is she took that as an opportunity to bring them as a partner. And so she gave them a little bit more about what this project was. And this was out at First Creek, where they're creating nature play. And it ended up that she got them so involved and engaged in the project, they became an advocate and actually found timber when she was looking for it. And so don't be afraid to cast that net pretty large and make sure people understand what the project is about. Because even if they're a regulator, having that little bit of background will help them buy into what you were trying to do as a team.
Yeah, and if I remember right, Laura, I think they got fined because they moved the fence temporarily for some sort of access and then moved it back. But I guess that kind of defeated the purpose of the fence being there. So I can see both sides of that. I can see both sides of that one. We wanted the fence up so you didn't drive there. I would offer another example where part of this is also over communicating. So just because now we have this team and we're not going to change order proof our set of plans, don't assume everybody is on the same page all the time about everything. So in some cases, you need to over communicate, especially when it comes to clarifying assumptions and expectations. So as an example, I experienced recently on a project was where this came down to the CAD surface. Okay, so we're doing more naturalized channel designs. They have very, very detailed topography in a lot of cases. And, you know, what does the contractor want to build it? Is it really going to be, you know, just sort of coordinates and line geometry on a set of on the plans? Or are they going to use GPS enabled construction equipment? Are they going to, you know, and really this comes back to how really detailed and tight does that actual CAD topo surface need to be if that's what the contractor is going to use to build it. And so on a project recently, there were the designer hadn't anticipated getting the surface to that level because they hand drew some of the contours, I think. And the contractor, their surveyor, got into some delays and needing to redo some things because they had to go get a new surface from the engineer because they fixed some of these gaps where you see some of these little holes in the topo. And then ended up being a little change order that would have been nice to avoid if that would have been communicated amongst the team. So some of these details need to get figured out. They don't just happen by osmosis. We gotta talk through them. So, okay, on to number 3.
So inclusion is good, but also when you have a large team, it's also about making sure you're all going in the same direction. So you really do need to take the time in this process to set your project vision, your goals and objectives, and make sure all the partners are part of that process. So you might have to do that several times over, and that's actually just a really good thing to always emphasize and clarify where you're going. I just had a recent example of a project that we had a vision for, which was a place to gather, play, and explore the South Platte River. And we quickly learned, as Dave showed you, and if I go back one more, we weren't rowing in the same direction. And Dave can't make a plug for his book, or he wouldn't, but I can. This is an excellent book if you want to learn how to be an effective client.
Well, that's why I had the rowing team on the cover, was because the client's kind of the one there yelling at everybody to row, but we're all in the boat together, right? But it is important that everybody's rowing the same direction. Yeah.
We're all in. And what we found out with that project is that this idea of gather, play, and explore, the more we went with play, we found out from the city council that they really didn't want people to play in the water. And it was really good to clarify that, because a lot of the elements that we were including had this more of a beach entry, so that we could have access in. And so that changed how we are going to approach the design and look at it a little bit differently. And so taking the time to really understand that and put visuals with it will really help your team go in that right direction.
Yeah, so this was the vision that you all had, but then when you brought that to city council, they were like, no.
Not so much.
That's good to do early on, though, and make sure there was alignment, especially from council and their expectations.
There would have been a lot of frustration if we brought them something at the end that was like, whoa, that's not what we were looking for.
Yeah, and this is a picture of a different project, by the way. So along these same lines, you know, rowing in the same direction, right? And making sure all the partners are part of the process. You got everybody in the boat and all rowing together and in unison. That's where we can't take for granted how vital it is that certain key meetings get a little more attention than others. But not only that, like the manner and discourse within our meetings, that's where the psychological safety comes in. But I think there are certain meetings where we need to sort of maybe have a little more formality to them, if you will. So one is at design kickoff. When we kick off the design, that's where inclusion really matters, and maybe having more departments from the city or local government be included in that. You might end up with 15 to 20 people. You want to have the design team and all their subs there. Really get everybody on the same page, make sure everybody's hearing all about what the goals are, what the constraints are, and make sure everybody's hearing the same things all together. There's just so much that goes into that. The other two that I think are also vital, where you similarly need to have that big sense of inclusion, and you might have 15, 20 people there, is the contractor kickoff. Because when we do project partners, we typically get to maybe a 20 or 30% design before we bring a contractor on. And I had a contractor tell me once that often they would just get invited to whatever was the next design progress meeting, and they may or may not get introduced, and like, oh, there's Joe and Bob, they're the contractor, welcome. And then they would just go on with a normal design meeting. And it's like, well, no. Here's some new faces. They're very key people to this team. Let's revisit the goals, our why for this project, what it is we're trying to do. Okay, and then the third point, the third really key meeting, of course, is the pre-construction meeting, where now you're going to introduce some more new faces who are going to actually be there to help you build it. Some of the people that will actually be out in the field, some of which may not have been involved in all the design meetings. And so really, I've found it beneficial to have the design process be more of something that happens as by way of our meetings. And we talk about the designs in the meetings, and we get progress updates from the team either every couple of weeks or maybe once a month. And that's how we go through the design and comment processes in the meetings, instead of like this submittal, wait 2 weeks for the client to review it, send back red lines. It's like, no. We're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. We're going to make design a social activity. Design should be a social activity with project partners, including all the right people at the right time. Okay.
I love that saying, design is a social activity.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. Number 4.
This was one of my favorite sayings that when we first brought this out was, don't worry, Laura, I didn't make them mad. And that was really coming a lot from our construction managers, because they had this misconception that if I made somebody mad, then they weren't being a partner. And so we want to spend a little bit of time with some examples of collaborative teams include healthy tension. And then also, again, you're part of a team, and how do you respect others' perspectives and views and skills, but then bring your own to the table? And so I can remember when someone actually said that to me about, I didn't make them mad. I'm like, well, tell me a little bit more about what was going on. And they were talking about water control wasn't being done, they thought, as effectively as they thought. But they didn't want to push it any further with the contractor, so they just let it go. It's like, oh, no, that's not what I mean by partnering. It's how do you ask the right questions so you're not making them defensive about it, but ultimately we need solid water control. So we still want to have that end in mind.
Well, and also with design, wanting to make these sort of multi-objective projects, there should be tension between competing things in a confined, in a fairly limited amount of space. There's going to be tension between different design elements too. Like, and if you don't have some tension in trying to figure that stuff out, then you're probably not pushing each other enough.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things we talk about when, you're in a team environment. Someone's going to put out a draft idea, right? But think of it as draft. You're not offending anyone by adding to it, and really being excited and collaborative about how you get to a solution. And so that's something we just really want to stress with this project, is how do you create that healthy tension? Did you want to expand on that anymore, Dave?
Yeah, and I can say too, as much as we might want there to be psychological safety, again, that I can't make people trust each other or feel comfortable. I can't make people feel comfortable saying certain things in a big meeting with everybody there. And so I had a contractor mention to me that, hey, one time I had something I might have wanted to say about the design in a big meeting, but I didn't want to make the designer look bad in front of the client. And he didn't tell me what the nature of the comment was, but he was saying how at times it might actually be nice to have the design and builders meet on their own on the side without the ownership team. That might feel safer at times. Or even on bigger projects, I've had the design team, they have their own meetings without the owners sometimes. We don't have to be at everything. You don't go like heading off into the woods without us or anything. But like, by all means, if you guys feel like you need to have your own meetings on the side with each other, there's certainly room for that, because, you know, we come in and we kind of end up being the gorilla in the room, and whether we like it or not. So that's something to keep in mind. Yeah.
Yeah, I can remember a time when I was still on the design side. One of the most memorable moments I have is my mentor was Chuck McKnight. I worked for Sellards and Gregg, and he and Bill Wank were designing this drop structure at Bible Park. And the two of them were just like in this zen, building off of each other. There was bumwad, tracing paper, and Sharpies, and it was just an explosion of ideas and energy. And that's something I often think about is that I know we're hitting a collaborative process when we come out of a meeting energized versus coming out of a meeting just drained. You know, that's it's work at that point. It's not a social engagement. And so having that in your mind, I think when you're part of these teams is really important. And how can you create that atmosphere of building off of each other's ideas and getting to something better? That's all in good faith of enjoying each other.
And that's where the word healthy tension is important, because we shouldn't, you know, we want to have healthy conflict and tension, but, you know, not getting mad at each other, but, you know, that we're going to build. It's got to be constructive. Yes. Yeah. So along those lines, I find and especially these bigger design projects, I found this model that I find really helpful as a way of thinking about a way that the project can unfold from when the design kicks off, is that, especially the more complicated the project is, you really want to have this inclusive, especially with the design team and anybody who's an important stakeholder that's going to have influence over what success looks like, is you want to just throw everything against the wall and really create choices and explore options, be unbounded, unconstrained. You know, if money were no object, what would we do? Those sorts of things, and really just lay it out there. And then eventually, you know, you're going to have to come up against your constraints and say, okay, well, we've laid out all these choices. Of these choices, here's what we have time and money and land for, whatever the constraints may be, and what's realistic, or maybe some things are a future phase, but at least you kind of know what's possible on down the road with this whole project. And then you go into making choices. Okay, now we're going to converge and execute on the project. And the big thing is, when you're on the left side of that blue line, that's where inclusion, having lots of people involved in the meetings, you're not doing things sequentially with the passing of baton, you're the football team huddling and talking about where you're trying to get to and what are the possible plays we could call here, right? You're just talking about play calling. And really that's an important thing. And this can come into a way this manifests itself as an example is the cross section. Let's talk about how we're laying out the cross section. So this one little spot on this project, especially when you're on a creek like the West Fork of Second Creek right here, is inches matter, tenths matter. And this can matter if you're trying to do multi-purpose with trails and bridges and things like that, but also matters with, where is it going to be wet enough for us to get wetlands here? You know, we can't have it 2 feet up. You know, if that this cross section goes up 2 feet, we're not going to get wetlands 2 feet vertically up from the bottom of this channel. That's not going to happen. So as you're laying out the cross section, that needs to be an inclusive process between hydraulics and ecologists and landscape architects. In a more extreme example, you get something like this, which is Little Dry Creek at Westminster Station. Everything you see in that picture we built as a part of this project or with phases that were in conjunction with our project. And think about the cross section that just goes under that PED bridge, which you can see here. You know, you've got a lot of things. You got the people coming down from the station. You've got, you know, flood risk. You've got clearance to the bridge. You can't be doing that alone as an engineer, right? You need to be including people. And it needs to be a together sort of thing, a social sort of thing. So going back to this picture, now you look at that island in the middle and those little stepping stones. If you think about this island here and trying to detail where these stepping stones, there's so much elevation and planimetrics that go into that this is where the landscape architect and the engineer and the contractor need to be making jazz. You know, is this thing buildable, right? You want to make constructible designs rather than making a design and then later figuring out if it's constructible. Or the island here with the stepping stones, let's see, and I'll kind of skip forward to that. Upper right, that's the detail for the stepping stones. The contractor had input into that detail because we needed the thing to be buildable, right? So all these guys have to be together, and gals get together and make jazz, but you got to do that together. All right. Design is a
jazz.
social activity. All right.
All right. So now we're making jazz. One of my favorite things about project partners is this idea of, the limb is a really lonely place to be. So being out there together certainly gives us a lot of comfort. So how do we identify and share risk? And then how do we have each other's back? And, the things that come to mind with sharing risk is that we were doing that river run project, and we were putting a lot of boulders in, but we also wanted them to be a little smoother because we knew people were going to be on them. We were creating this surf wave. And so we were able to get this wasted material from a mining operation down in Fairplay. So we had to just pay for the transportation up to here, but it was a short time frame to do it. And we still hadn't had our 408 permissions from the Corps. So as a team, we evaluated that risk. And instead of us just saying, yes, ship it, or the contractor, it's all on you, we don't necessarily have a place for you to stockpile. We worked as a team to go out on this limb to actually mobilize the contractor, create an area, and start stockpiling the boulders ahead of knowing if we really were going to be able to go that season. And it actually went down to about a day and a half before we were going to have to pull the trigger that we got that 408. And the relief that we all had with it was fantastic. But the fact that we weren't going to let anybody hang out there by themselves, I think, was the really important part. And we were able to provide a huge savings to the project in order to secure that rock.
So Lori, the contractor did the purchase order for the rock before they were under contract, right? And how much was that?
So we were 50 grand.
How much?
50,000.
50,000?
Yes. And again, we looked at it as a team, and we all said, if we have to pay for the rock and let it sit somewhere, we'll let it sit somewhere, and we'll find enough spots to keep it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just wanted to let you guys know we're at about 5 minutes.
Great. And that's something you just can't do in a normal environment. And the last story I'll just share with you about having each other's back, because this is so important. When you toss somebody under the bus, you don't just burn that bridge, but everybody else who's aware that you did that, you've also burned that, because there's going to be no trust. We had a project that was on North Sanderson Gulch, and just like Dave said, inches matter. We all totally missed that the plans had the wetland bench 2 feet above the invert, and it really was supposed to be a couple of inches. The contractor had already demobilized. We were in for the plantings when it got caught. And instead of people all pointing to, well, who did the drawing, who reviewed the permit, who didn't catch that, it was just coming together of, let's solve the problem. And by the time I even got back to the office, the design engineer was already calling saying, we'll help pay for mobilizing them back to the site. And same with our ecologist that we had. And so it's that idea of, let's solve the problem as a team. And that just created such trust between us from that point on that you just can't get in another way. So using project partners, I think, to build trust and accountability. The takeaways we really want to give you today is about, giving each other permission, be inclusive, be in alignment, how to be collaborative, and share your risk. And remember, partner is a noun, be the verb, do the partnering end of it. That's the harder work, but there's so much more benefit that you, your project, and our communities are going to get, because we're here to protect people, property, in our environment. So thank you for your time today. There's a couple of minutes left if there's any questions.
Yeah, we did have a couple of questions come in. Thanks, guys. That was really great. So one of the questions, when you look at this project partnering concept, is there a concern about the partner relationship being, quote, too comfortable and missing out on new ideas and perspectives from outsiders?
That's such a good point. So 2 quick things. One, we evaluate a pre-qualified list annually. And it's not just the district, but it's also all of our partners, all our local governments also provide that feedback, so that we are getting a broad perspective of performance, because we really only want people that are performing and have that high level of trust on the team. And then the second part of that was, are we missing out on others? We try to keep a portion of our work. We try to keep it in that 20 to 30% goes to people that aren't on our on-call list, so we can continue to develop new relationships. And I'll put a plug in if anybody's interested in that. Barbara Chungtua at our office is your contact to be able to get in and see if we have we mesh up with wanting to work together in the future. Dave, anything to add?
Well, I would say there's still a spirit of competition because, like I said, everybody wants to do good work and get the next project. That is a wonderful quality and cost control, but it also creates the safe space for innovation to become more possible. I also work, we all work with all the different designers and builders. So, I mean, it's not just like any one contractor's getting all of it or any one designer's getting all of it. There's a lot of variety and they are incentivized to keep up their game for sure. Other questions?
Yeah, one more question that I had actually. So you talked about this concept of psychological safety. And Dave, you talked a little bit about having those separate breakout meetings if you need to. I'm curious what other practical ways you could use to foster that psychological safety in a group.
No, I appreciate that question because it's something I was going to mention and forgot to is I think number one, owners, we lead the project whether we like it or not, and we need to model that behavior because everybody else will sort of follow suit. And so along those lines, I think it's helpful to, especially at those key meetings I mentioned, like at design kickoff, at contractor kickoff, at pre-construction, and maybe occasionally in between, but it's to actually intentionally say, this is a thing we value with this sort of project delivery. It is a place, it is a safe space where nobody's going to get made fun of for bringing up wild ideas. We don't want to implement a bad idea, but I don't mind bringing up something, just make it amusing. Anything you want. And I actually did that in a meeting. And later on in the meeting, somebody chimed in an idea. And as they chimed in, they literally said, well, Dave, you said no idea is a bad idea and we should all just chime in. So here goes. And I just felt so good about that. But I'm not sure that would have happened if I didn't, sort of make it feel safe, if you will, give permission, to sort of vocalize that. So that would be one suggestion.
Great. Well, that's about our time. I don't see any other questions coming in from the chat. So wanted to thank you guys. That was an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it, thought the content was really great. And just a reminder to everybody that we will be sending out CECs after today's presentation. And remember to submit your abstracts and awards for the CASFM conference.
Great, thanks everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thanks guys, bye.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you guys.